Justice League Unlimited, the role-playing game, is an officially licensed DC Comics tabletop RPG from publisher D20 Culture, co-designed by Lucas Conti and Peterson Rodriguez, with veteran comic writer Mark Waid attached as both co-writer and setting authority. Waid's involvement is notable here, as he's one of DC's most prolific modern writers and the architect behind the new history of the DC universe. His involvement gives this game a strong claim to being very continuity conscious. For those who've been following superhero RPGs on this channel, the obvious point of comparison is Batman Gotham City Chronicles, the role-playing game from Monolith. But these are very different products. Gotham City Chronicles was a narrower, more tactical adaptation built specifically around Batman's corner of the DC universe, drawing heavily from Monolith's Skirmish board game as well as a rule set more or less based on D&D 3rd edition. Justice League Unlimited, by contrast, is aiming for something broader, a full universe role-playing system designed to support everything from street-level vigilantes to cosmic tier heroes across the entire DC mythos, with a lighter touch on the rules. In other words, Justice League Unlimited is positioning itself as DC's bigger, more expansive answer. The kind of game where Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, and obscure C-list metahumans can all plausibly share the same table. In this video, I want to walk you through the free quick start for this game and go through the basic mechanics, how combat and health works, and how much ground this game intends to cover. Then I'll give you my honest opinion about this game so far. And while I think the system itself has some promising ideas, the biggest obstacle here, I think, has nothing to do with the mechanics at all. Let's jump in. As with many or most Supers RPGs, this one tries to organize all characters and enemies into tiers of power. In this case, starting with E for ordinary humans, to D, early metas, all the way to S, which would be something like Spectre or Darkseid or Anti-Monitor. This choice of tier determines the range of your starting stats, as well as some limits on things like your core attributes and the level or grade of your powers. Resolve is basically your hit points and energy points rolled into one. It's used to track damage as well as to spend on certain powers. The game uses a meta currency called plot points, and they do things like guarantee a success, negate an attack, retcon a piece of gear or an NPC, or just massage the scene in some way. The designers went with the way of a GM meta currency as well. Every time a player uses a plot point, the GM gets an editorial point. Game masters in this game are actually called editors, by the way, because they're editing a comic. There are actually a number of references to comic book creation throughout the mechanics, but I'm just going to refer to editors as GMs for clarity here. Anyway, GMs can spend one editorial point per scene to add a new twist or trick. GM meta currencies can be divisive, but here the exchange creates a visible economy of fairness. For example, in this game, if a player spends a plot point to radically change the scene in favor of the heroes, then the GM later in the scene spends an editorial point to employ some ridiculous plot twist to the detriment of the heroes, it's not the GM coming out of left field and being unfair. There's a sense that they're just spending a point in the game and playing by the rules, not being randomly vindictive. There is one other element that suppresses the use of plot points by players, and I actually really appreciate this. Every time a player uses one of these meta points, they have to roll a d6. If the result is equal to or lower than the number of points used in the campaign or issue thus far, then they have to roll a d20 on this crisis table. This is a great table that really injects some randomness into a scene, and they range from the extreme of all heroes losing all of their internal powers all the way to heroes get a new temporary ability. The idea being that overusing plot points becomes a dangerous gamble. Looking at character creation, as I mentioned earlier, there are 6 different tiers that you first have to choose from. In the quick start here, they only sample the starting numbers for a tier D and C hero, which is fine. But when I filled out a character sheet, I did have some basic gaps in some of my stats, which I presume would be filled if I had a higher tier hero. Here are your stats right here. There are 6 core attributes and 4 secondary attributes. It looks all mathy, but it's actually pretty nicely laid out because as you spend experience points, aka ascension points, aka packs, Yes, that's confusing. I don't know why they went with packs. But anyway, as you spin packs and gain new powers, abilities, and gear, your base score and modifiers for each of these stats will change. So it's nice to have an exploded view of the numbers. These 6 core attributes only go up by multiples of 3, and they cost 5 packs each to increase any one by 1 increment. Okay, on to maybe the most important feature of this game, the powers. Your first source of powers are your origin. In this quick start, you have humans, which are limited to martial training and technology, Kryptonians, which, like Superman, have all of these powers, and metahumans, which, if you're not familiar with the lore, they're roughly equivalent to Marvel's mutants, though mechanically broader. Metahumans have access to all the superpowers listed in the game, but they have to buy them with packs. Your second source of power is your archetype. For example, the Champions of Tomorrow are a generic sort of team-based hero who start with 2 of these 4 abilities. Interestingly, this archetype comes with a code of conduct, one that might sound really familiar to you if you've spent a lifetime reading comics or watching cartoons based on comics. Always allow a wounded villain a chance to surrender, always obey the law, always prioritize the rescue of innocents. It's the code of conduct that has been the staple of core superhero behavior since the beginning of American comics. Another archetype would be the Dark Knight, which has the limitation of any grade 1 power, and above grade 1, you can only choose martial training or technology powers, which is to say, you can only have low-level superpowers and everything else has to be Batman-style powers. The selection of archetype abilities here definitely tries to recreate the Bat-Person family of abilities. Genius is another archetype. You always roll disadvantage on initiative rolls because you're overthinking things, but you can place allies in strategic positions and repair any device made on Earth. The fourth and final archetype in the quick start is the Enraged, who can't help civilians in a scene until all threats are neutralized. The powers are focused on combat. I'm actually not sure how many more archetypes there are for this game, but I imagine that there will at least be a couple more given the breadth of DC Comics heroes. One of the ones mentioned in the promotional copy is the anti-hero archetype, which could be pretty interesting. Regarding the full list of available powers in the game, they're divided into martial training, superpowers, and technology. You only get to see grade 1 and grade 2 powers from each of these 3 categories, but the grades go up to 5, which gives you an idea of how crazy things can get. With martial training, the powers are subdivided into swordsman, martial master, and marksman, and of course, they're mostly focused on combat because martial. The quote-unquote superpowers are way more varied and encompass the majority of abilities that DC heroes have in the comics. I'm actually not sure if we're getting the full list for each subcategory in this quick start though. For example, animal mimicry only has 4 powers under grade 1 and 2 under grade 2. It seems like there could be more. But this overall gives a good idea of what this game has to offer and how it wants players to solve problems. Elasticity, elemental manipulation, energy blasts, enhanced resistance, flight, all of these categories of powers are essentially meant to solve comic book style problems. But yeah, again, I think I'm really hoping that these lists under each subcategory are a bit longer in the final game. I thought it was interesting that the designers had to sort of nerf the speed force a bit. I'm a big fan of the Flash, maybe more than any other DC hero, so I got a chuckle here out of the fact that they had to do this. Speedsters really would be too powerful for this game if they were built faithfully with the mechanics. Anyway, the third major category of powers is technology, and presumably this is going to be the second largest list of powers in the final game. Notice, by the way, how expensive it is to purchase exoskeleton powers. 8 packs per grade is almost 3 times the going rate for a lot of these powers. But you are looking at some powerful abilities that you wouldn't otherwise have as a mere human. When it comes to how the dice actually work, it's a familiar rollover d20 setup. On any given check, you roll a d20, add the full sum of your relevant core attribute, and add or subtract any modifiers from powers, abilities, gear, or environment. That number needs to meet or exceed a target number to pass. In combat, each hero gets 3 actions per turn, and that includes movement. When they are attacked, they rely on their defense value, but depending on the attack, they might be able to add one of their attributes to their defense score for more protection. There are 4 types of damage in the game: physical, energy, magical, and psychic, and they're each associated with a different attribute. Conditions progress linearly, and you suffer from increasing mechanical penalties until you can get healed. But these are different from statuses, of which there are 18, and which also each impose a mechanical penalty, so your hero can get hobbled pretty badly outside of just losing resolve points. Important to note that this game's combat works in zones and with 4 abstracted distance steps rather than by a grid, so you're never going to be measuring and figuring numbers of feet or meters to a target or with an attack's range. The game wants the GM to use clocks to count down threats, which is nothing new, but it's something that I think is vital to have in any GM's toolbox. It also describes a type of scene that isn't quite combat, nor is it really a blow-by-blow roleplay scene. These so-called rescue scenes give each PC just 1 special heroic action per turn, and they each have a consequence for failure. It's an interesting approach that I think can cover a lot of narrative ground quickly, although I'm not sure there's much opportunity to roleplay here if ultimately everyone's turn is just boiled down to a pass-fail roll. Here's an interesting feature, though not surprising. Death is completely up to the player. Their hero can pick up 23 different debilitating conditions or statuses. They can lose all their health and their ability to use their powers. They can be reduced to a heap of smoking flesh, but they never die unless the player wants them to. This makes sense, and honestly, I do see this in RPGs from time to time, even ones that aren't based on a medium where the characters pretty much never die. In this case, it's just another place where the game is leaning in to its goal of recreating comic book style storytelling. Here's what a mid-level enemy stat block looks like. Most importantly, all enemies have a tier, which means that you can quickly sort them against the tiers of the heroes. They have a resolve pool, powers, which unfortunately you have to cross-reference and then either bookmark or transcribe somewhere, then 1 or more attacks with a to hit and damage value, then a few special abilities. These first 2 for a Talon are extremely powerful, by the way, which is good. Enemies need to punch really hard, so to speak, in order to pose any challenge to, superheroes. So alright, here are my thoughts so far on Justice League Unlimited, the RPG. Cons: catching up on the canon. This is the biggest problem with any DC or Marvel RPG right here. Just everyone having a shared and at least somewhat equal or functional understanding of the universe which their characters inhabit and interact with. With DC Comics, let's start with the most obvious point of common knowledge, and that would be the DC cinematic universe, the movies and the TV shows. Just for argument's sake, let's completely ignore those, throw them out, every last one of them, and focus only on the comic book universe itself. Well, since the start of DC Comics in 1939, that universe has been rebooted and reimagined from top to bottom at least 5 times. And these aren't minor changes either. In one continuity, Superman starts his career as Superboy and spends time with the Legion of Superheroes. In another, Superboy is a completely separate clone of Superman. Jason Todd dies and stays dead for years until another reboot brings him back as Red Hood. Barbara Gordon goes from Batgirl to Oracle after being paralyzed by the Joker, then back to Batgirl again, depending on the era. Wonder Woman's origin alone has shifted between clay-born demigod, daughter of Zeus, and multiple alternate revisions. Even something as simple as who is the current Robin can produce a different answer depending on which timeline you're pulling from. In some timelines, Batman has 1 Robin, in others he has 5. In some, Barry Allen died saving reality, in others he came back and rewrote it. There's a very helpful website called Comic Book Herald where you can access a beginner's guide to DC Comics, but there are no fewer than 4 different approaches, according to this site, on how to even begin tackling the DC comic universe, and they're all pretty commitment heavy. Pros: fast, familiar D20 system. The mechanics are not based on any particular RPG, but they are quite familiar. There's nothing really exotic in the mechanics here, and that means you can get the game running quickly with anyone who has any familiarity with a D20 based RPG. The 3 action economy is solid. I like that a player can resolve 1 or more of their actions to use defensively as a reaction later in a round. Also, attacking more than once per turn will diminish the chance that they land the hit after the first attack. But yeah, generally 3 actions per turn feels like the right amount of room for light tactics. The powers look promising. I can't tell you for sure that the powers and abilities lists will be comprehensive, but given the sample that was provided in the quick start and the fact that they hired DC Comics super guru Mark Waid to check details, I assume that the final list of options for your superhero would be fully inclusive, covering virtually every base you could think of. Wish list, a multiverse omniverse primer. As mentioned in my con for this game, the DC canon is utterly daunting. Even if you read all the required reading and got caught up on all the universe reboots of the IP, you'd still have to contend with everyone else at the table who might have a different approach to the canon. I think the best solution would be a definitive primer that laid out exactly which omniverse or timeline is being adopted for this game, or better yet, a summary of all of them so that tables can choose where they want to enter. But yeah, that's all I've got on Justice League Unlimited, the RPG so far. I'd love to hear your comments on this project, as well as what you're hoping to see most out of this game. Links for everything are below, and remember to like and subscribe for more RPG reviews, and join the channel as a member for exclusive videos and content. I'll see you in the next one.